September 27th, 1942. 8:52 in the morning. The South Atlantic Ocean, a desolate expanse of gray water halfway between Brazil and Africa. A thick, disorienting fog clings to the surface of the sea, muffling the world in a shroud of silence. Aboard the American Liberty ship SS Stephen Hopkins, the mood is one of quiet monotony. They are alone, a single, slow-moving target in the vast wilderness of the ocean. The Stephen Hopkins is not a warship. She is a 7,000-ton steel box designed to carry cargo, not to fight. Her skin is thin, her top speed a sluggish 11 knots, and her crew is a mix of civilian merchant mariners and a small U.S. Navy armed guard detachment. They are en route from Cape Town to Suriname, sailing empty to pick up a load of bauxite for the ravenous American war machine. Suddenly, a shape coalesces in the mist, then another. 2 ships, less than 2 miles off the starboard bow. At first there is confusion. Allied vessels? Neutrals? But as the fog thins, the reality becomes horrifyingly clear. The lead ship is low, gray, and predatory. Her lines are not those of a freighter. This is a wolf in sheep's clothing, the German auxiliary cruiser Steer, a disguised commerce raider armed with 6 powerful 5.9-inch guns, deck-mounted torpedo tubes, and a crew of over 300 Kriegsmarine sailors. With her was her supply ship, the Tonnenfels. A signal flashes from the German warship. The message is blunt, unequivocal. Heave to. Do not use your radio. Surrender or be fired upon. This is the moment of decision. The rules of engagement, the very logic of survival, dictate only one course of action for a vessel like the Stephen Hopkins. You do not fight a warship. You surrender. To resist is suicide. Any attempt to fight back would be a violation of the natural order of naval warfare, a pointless sacrifice of the ship and every man aboard it. The forbidden tool in this encounter was not a secret weapon. It was the ship's own armament, so pitifully inadequate it was almost an insult. On the stern of the Stephen Hopkins sat a single, lonely 4-inch naval gun, a relic from the First World War. It was a pop gun against the raiders' heavy artillery. To fire it would be an act of profound, wasteful defiance. It was a weapon not meant to win a battle, but merely to signal a final, desperate refusal to die on one's knees. On the bridge of the Stephen Hopkins, Captain Paul Buck stared at the German raider. He knew the odds. He knew what surrender meant. Captivity for the crew and another victory for the enemy strangling the Allied supply lines. And in that silent, fog-shrouded moment, he made a decision that sealed the fate of 2 ships and every man aboard them. He turned to the commander of the Navy gun crew, Lieutenant Kenneth Willett, and gave a quiet order that broke every rule in the book. He would not surrender. He would fight. Down below, at that single 4-inch gun, a 22-year-old cadet midshipman from the Merchant Marine Academy felt the ship begin a slow turn, bringing his weapon to bear on the enemy. His name was Edwin O'Hara, and with the clang of the first shell being rammed into the breech of his gun, he committed himself to an action that would either be a footnote in a tragedy or the catalyst for a legend.
Edwin Joseph O'Hara was not a seasoned naval gunner. He was a student. Before the war, he was an engine cadet at the United States Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point, New York. The wartime curriculum was accelerated. 8 weeks of basic training, 6 months at sea, and then 9 more months of classwork. O'Hara was in the middle of his 6-month sea assignment. He was a quiet, focused young man from California, obsessed not with the engines he was supposed to be studying, but with the science of gunnery. He was, in essence, a naval theorist trapped in the body of a trainee mechanic. He saw the world through angles, trajectories, and the cold, hard mathematics of ballistics. The single 4-inch gun on the stern of his ship was not just a piece of hardware to him. It was an instrument, and he had spent his voyage mastering its every gear and calculation. The mission of the SS Stephen Hopkins was simple: to exist, to carry cargo from one port to another, forming one small link in the immense chain of Allied logistics. But in the autumn of 1942, that simple existence was a life-or-death gamble. The South Atlantic was a hunting ground. German commerce raiders, or Hilfskreuzer, prowled these waters with impunity. These were converted merchant ships, like the Stier, packed with hidden weaponry and designed for a single purpose: to find and sink Allied freighters, starving Britain and the Soviet Union into submission. The Stier, under the command of Horst Gerlach, was one of the most feared of these predators, a ghost that had already sent 3 Allied ships to the bottom. On board the Stephen Hopkins, O'Hara was part of a small, tight-knit community. There was Captain Paul Buck, a veteran of the sea lanes who believed in the defiant spirit of the merchant marine. There was Lieutenant Junior Grade Kenneth M. Willett, a Navy reservist from California, and the commander of the Armed Guard Detachment. He and O'Hara had formed a friendship, 2 Californians fascinated by the deadly craft of naval gunnery. The rest of the gun crew was a collection of young Navy sailors, many of whom had never seen the ocean before the war, their training rushed and their experience minimal. They were the forgotten Navy, a special branch assigned the thankless, terrifying duty of defending slow-moving targets against attack. The situation on the water deteriorates with shocking speed. The Germans, stunned by the American ship's refusal to surrender, unleash a torrent of fire. The first salvos from the Stier's 5.9-inch guns are brutally effective. They don't just pierce the Hopkins' thin hull, they tear through it. One of the first shells smashes into the bridge, mortally wounding Captain Buck and others. Another shell finds the engine room. Down below, where O'Hara should have been, there is a concussive blast, the roar of escaping steam, and then silence. The Black Gang, the men who kept the ship alive, die at their posts. The Stephen Hopkins loses power and slows to a crawl, becoming a dead-in-the-water target. Simultaneously, the second German ship, the Tannenfels, closes in, its machine guns strafing the decks, cutting down anyone caught in the open. Radio calls for help are impossible. The radio shack is one of the first things destroyed. On the stern, Lieutenant Willett is severely wounded by shrapnel. The American ship is blind, crippled, and burning. From the bridge of the Stier, Captain Gerlach must have believed the fight was over. It had lasted only a few minutes. All that was left was to finish the job. From his station in the shattered engine room, Edwin O'Hara knew the ship was dying. The engines were gone. The order to abandon ship was echoing through the vessel. He made his way onto the deck and was met with a scene of absolute carnage. Smoke choked the air, fires raged, and the dead and wounded were strewn across the steel plates. His place, his duty, was to find a lifeboat. But as he looked aft toward the stern, he saw the source of the ship's Defiance. The 4-inch gun was still firing, but the crew was gone. The designated Navy gunners lay dead or wounded around their post. Lieutenant Willett, despite his grievous injuries, was coordinating the return fire, but the gun itself was being served by a shrinking group of volunteers, merchant seamen, engineers, anyone still standing. O'Hara didn't hesitate. He wasn't a gunner's mate. He was an engine cadet. But in that moment, the distinction was meaningless. He ran to the gun. This was his aha moment. It wasn't a flash of tactical brilliance in the traditional sense. It was the stark, simple realization that the only thing left to do, the only logical choice in a world gone mad, was to put as many shells into the enemy as possible before they were all killed. His unorthodox solution was not a trick. It was an act of pure, distilled, and lethal competence. While the German gunners relied on their advanced fire control system to bracket the Hopkins, O'Hara relied on his eye, his training, and his intimate knowledge of his weapon. He began to serve the gun,
helping the volunteers load and fire. The Hopkins, turning its stern to the enemy, presented the smallest possible target while keeping its only effective weapon in the fight. And then, O'Hara's shells began to land. From the bridge of the Steer, the situation was becoming incomprehensible. This was not supposed to be happening. A freighter, a Liberty ship, was fighting back with impossible ferocity and accuracy. And it was hurting them, badly. One of O'Hara's 4-inch shells smashed into the Steer's steering gear, making the ship difficult to control. Another shell penetrated deep into the hull and exploded in the engine room, knocking out the ship's power and starting a fire near the oil bunkers. The German raider, the Hunter, was suddenly crippled. Captain Gerlach was in a state of shock. He was being systematically dismantled by a ship that should have surrendered without firing a shot. His crew, young and inexperienced, began to feel the first tremors of panic. They were winning. Their heavy guns were turning the Hopkins into a floating inferno, but they were paying a catastrophic price. This wasn't a battle. It was a ghost story coming to life. They were being haunted by a dying ship that refused to die. The controlled collapse of the Stephen Hopkins was brutal and swift. A German shell finally hit the ammunition magazine for the 4-inch gun, causing a massive explosion that killed the last of the volunteer gun crew and threw Lieutenant Willett to the deck. The gun fell silent. But the fight wasn't over. Edwin O'Hara, somehow still alive, rose to his feet. Alone, wounded, and surrounded by the bodies of his comrades, he saw the ready box next to the gun had been blown open. Inside were 5 live shells. What happened next was an act of almost superhuman will. Single-handedly, he lifted the heavy shells, loaded the gun, aimed, and fired. 5 times. He worked the breech, ejected the spent casings, and fired again. And according to the survivors, every single one of those last 5 shots was a direct hit. They struck the Steer at the waterline, tearing open her hull and sealing her fate. A few moments later, a final German shell exploded near the gun mount. Edwin O'Hara was killed instantly. The battle was over. At 10 a.m., the SS Stephen Hopkins, a blazing wreck from stem to stern, slipped beneath the waves of the Atlantic. From the German perspective, they had won. But their ship was a wreck. It was on fire, the rudder was jammed, and it was taking on water. The ghost, before it vanished, had delivered a mortal wound.
The first people to validate Edwin O'Hara's sacrifice were the men who watched him do it. 19 men managed to escape the sinking Stephen Hopkins in a single damaged lifeboat. Of the original crew of 57 men, including the Naval Armed Guard and 1 passenger, 42 were dead. For the next 31 days, the survivors drifted across 2,200 miles of open ocean, their numbers dwindling to 15 before they finally made landfall in Brazil. It was through their harrowing testimony that the story of the ship's defiant last stand and of the young cadet who fired its final shots would be told. There would be no tense debriefing for O'Hara, no stern-faced superior officer demanding an explanation for his actions. His reckoning was the battle itself. His irrefutable logic was written in fire and steel across the hull of the German raider. His defense was simple and unspoken. We were going to die anyway. We chose to die fighting. The ultimate vindication for this logic came not from an American admiral, but from the German captain himself. Aboard the Steer, the situation was hopeless. O'Hara's final devastating hits had ruptured the hull and started uncontrollable fires near a hold containing torpedoes. The ship was dead in the water, the rudder was useless, and the flooding could not be contained. Less than 2 hours after the Stephen Hopkins sank, forgotten Capitan Horst Gerlach gave the order to abandon ship. He gathered his surviving crew and transferred them to the Tannenfels. Then he scuttled his own warship to prevent it from falling into Allied hands. The ripple effect of this single engagement was enormous. A lone, poorly armed American Liberty ship had destroyed a heavily armed German commerce raider. It was the only time in the entire war that a U.S. merchant vessel sank a German surface warship. The legend of the freighter that fought like a battleship spread through the naval communities on both sides of the war, a testament to the fact that firepower is not the only factor in a fight. The reward for this incredible act of defiance was humble and posthumous. It did not come in a grand ceremony. Captain Paul Buck and Cadet Midshipman Edwin O'Hara were both awarded the Merchant Marine Distinguished Service Medal, the highest honor for that service. Lieutenant Kenneth Willett was awarded the Navy Cross. Later, ships would be named in their honor: the USS Kenneth M. Willett, the SS Paul Buck, and the SS Edwin O'Hara. At the Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point, the main gymnasium is named O'Hara Hall, a permanent tribute to the engine cadet who taught the world a lesson in gunnery. The most profound legacy of the Stephen Hopkins was the quiet integration of its spirit into naval doctrine. The story became a powerful training tool for the thousands of sailors in the Naval Armed Guard and the Merchant Marine. It was proof that fighting back, no matter the odds, was not a wasteful act of suicide. It was a viable and sometimes devastatingly effective tactical choice. It reinforced the importance of placing guns on every merchant ship, and more importantly, of training the men who manned them to believe they could make a difference. The unwritten doctrine became, "You are never out of the fight." The archived testimonies of the survivors paint a vivid picture of the battle's final moments. George S. Crunk, the ship's second engineer, who would heroically captain the lifeboat for its month-long journey to safety, described the chaos and the unwavering resolve of the crew. But the most powerful validation came from the enemy. German survivors from the Steer, after being captured later in the war, spoke of their shock and grudging respect for the American freighter that simply would not give up. They had faced a ghost ship, a vessel that fought with a fury they could not comprehend. Edwin O'Hara never returned to a quiet post-war life. He remains forever a 22-year-old midshipman, frozen in a single moment of extraordinary courage. The other survivors who reached the shores of Brazil would carry the memory of that day for the rest of their lives. Quiet heroes of a battle most of the world would never know. There is no final letter from Edwin O'Hara explaining his choice. His last confession was not written in ink, but in the 5 shells he fired alone at the end of the world. His reason was in the action itself. The citation for his Distinguished Service Medal attempts to capture it in formal language. For extraordinary heroism under unusual hazards, O'Hara ran aft and single-handedly served and fired the damaged gun with 5 live shells remaining in the ready box, scoring direct hits near the waterline of the second raider. O'Hara was mortally wounded in this action. But the cold language of a citation cannot capture the true meaning of that final act. It was a choice born of a deep, profound understanding taught not in a classroom, but in the crucible of combat, that when everything is already lost, the only thing you have left to give is defiance. And that is the enduring lesson of the SS Stephen Hopkins, that history is not always written by the victors, but sometimes it is carved into the sea by the defiant.